Less than 24 hours after Tracey Harris's 22nd birthday, she mysteriously disappeared. 1 week later, her body was found caught on a submerged tree branch in the Choctawhatchee River. At first, the medical examiner ruled her death a drowning, a conclusion that didn't sit right with many in the community. How could someone so afraid of water that she refused to learn how to swim end up drowning near a place she frequently visited with friends? That question troubled investigators for more than 30 years, until a woman's testimony finally brought the truth to light. Welcome to the last chapter, where cold cases are reopened and brought to light. The death of Tracey Harris was not just a single act of violence. It was the beginning of a mystery that would linger over a small Alabama town for nearly 3 decades, quietly shaping how people saw one another and how they came to understand justice itself. In 2020, a statement from a woman finally pointed investigators toward a suspect. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had lived under the same roof as Tracey, someone who had once been part of her daily life. The person who should have protected her had instead turned something familiar into something deeply disturbing. The case reveals the persistence of families who never gave up, investigators who refused to let the file fade into obscurity, and the gradual evolution of investigative work that allowed long-silenced truths to finally come to light. The community was changed forever. Fear spread through Ozark like an undercurrent no one could quite name. Neighbors became more watchful. The quiet trust that once defined the town began to fracture, and it would all come into focus when the truth finally surfaced nearly 30 years later. The most unsettling fact: a key figure connected to the case had been present from the very beginning, yet was never fully investigated. For decades, they attended community vigils, looked the parents in the eye, and hid unimaginable secrets behind a mask of innocence. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I'm always fascinated to see how far these stories travel and how they connect us across distances. Today we'll walk through the events of March 1990. We'll trace a case that lingered for decades without resolution and examine the moment that finally brought long-delayed answers to the death of Tracey Harris. This is a story of violence, silence, and the consequences of assumptions. A case where the truth was not entirely hidden, but simply overlooked. The town of Ozark, Alabama sat in the kind of deep South setting where tradition ran deep and private lives often stayed private. In the 1980s, it was a small, close-knit community where people knew one another, routines were familiar, and serious violence still felt like something that happened somewhere else. Tracey Harris was quiet, reserved, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. She began dating Carl Harris when she was 16 and he was 19, and the relationship moved quickly, leading to an unplanned pregnancy while she was still in high school. By 1986, they were married, and shortly afterward, they welcomed Carolyn into a world that was already beginning to grow unstable around them. The marriage was marked by constant conflict and eventually ended in divorce, but the separation did little to truly divide their lives. For the next 4 years, they continued living together in a complicated arrangement, sharing a home, and at times even a bed, in what friends described as an attempt to maintain stability for their daughter. Tracey worked as a waitress, keeping to a routine and doing what she could to provide. To those around her, Carolyn seemed to reflect her mother's gentle nature, the same quiet temperament that made Tracey well-liked within the Ozark community. The fragile peace of the Harris household shattered on March 7, 1990, just 24 hours after Tracey's 22nd birthday. Carl Harris contacted the authorities to report that Tracey had vanished. The news sent an immediate ripple of alarm through the town. In a community where families were tight-knit and routines were predictable, the idea of Tracey Harris voluntarily walking away from her 4-year-old daughter was dismissed as an impossibility. In the 1990s, the first 48 hours of a missing persons case were fraught with insurmountable hurdles. Without the modern luxuries of GPS tracking, cell tower pings, or digital footprints, investigators were essentially blind during the most critical window of the disappearance. In this pre-digital era, police could not trace Tracey's final movements or verify Carl's alibi through a smartphone. Furthermore, legal hurdles often prevented an immediate and aggressive response in no-body cases, as missing adults were frequently categorized as voluntary departures unless there was obvious evidence of a struggle. An absence of proof that in this case would cost investigators valuable time during the most critical stage of the disappearance. For 7 days, the search for Tracey Harris transformed the local landscape. Police officers, neighbors, and family members combed the woods and the outskirts of town. Their attention repeatedly returned to the Choctawhatchee River, a popular local gathering spot 7 miles from the home Tracey and Carl shared. On March 14th, a week after she was last seen, the search ended. Tracey's body was discovered in the river, snagged against a submerged branch. She was found naked from the waist up. While the medical examiner would later determine the cause of death was drowning, the presence of distinct bruising and ligature marks around her neck told a more violent story. The case was officially ruled a homicide. The discovery of the body in the river introduced a chilling paradox that investigators struggled to reconcile. While the Choctawhatchee was a place where Tracey often socialized with friends, it was also the setting of her greatest phobia. Selena Donson, a childhood friend who had been baptized alongside Tracey when they were 11, recalled a young girl paralyzed by terror, becoming hysterical at the mere prospect of being submerged in the water. Tracey Harris could not swim, and her fear of the water was a fact of common knowledge among her peers. This forensic detail served as a grim confirmation. Tracey had not entered the river by choice or by accident. In the 1990s, forensic science was a discipline of limitations. Recovering a body from a moving river presents a unique set of challenges. Water acts as a universal solvent, often washing away the trace evidence, hair, fibers, or skin cells, that modern DNA profiling relies upon to identify a killer. Without the benefit of contemporary genetic testing, the Ozark Police Department was forced to rely on the oldest tools in the investigative arsenal: timelines and testimony. Carl Harris, as the last person to see Tracey alive and the individual who reported her missing, became the immediate focal point of the inquiry. His account was straightforward. He had picked Tracey up from her waitressing job, dropped her at their home, and then departed for his own shift at the superfood supermarket. In those early interviews, Carl maintained a posture of total cooperation. He spoke of Tracey as the love of his life and opened his home to investigators multiple times. Each search yielded the same result: nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood spatter, and no physical clues that suggested a violent abduction. However, the lack of physical evidence at the crime scene was contrasted by a mountain of social evidence building in the town of Ozark. As detectives interviewed more than 15 witnesses, a terrifying portrait of the Harris marriage began to emerge. The tumultuous relationship described by the family was revealed to be a cycle of profound domestic violence. One witness, Dawn Halbert, soon to be Dawn Beasley, recounted a month-long period where she and her fiancé, Jeff Beasley, had lived under the same roof as the Harrises. Dawn described a household governed by Carl's rage and control. She detailed a specific evening where a simple request from Tracey for money to pay the water bill resulted in Carl lunging across the dinner table, his hands tightening around Tracey's throat until she was bent backward in a state of near suffocation. According to Dawn, Carl's control extended to Tracey's social life as he actively isolated her from friends. When asked about Carl by authorities, Dawn's assessment was blunt, reflecting a sentiment that was beginning to ferment across the entire community. This communal knowledge of the abuse created a secondary layer of investigation. In the milk aisle of local grocery stores and on the porches of Ozark homes, the townspeople had already reached a verdict. Another witness, Bobby Herring, informed police that he had seen Carl punch Tracey with enough force to knock her unconscious. Even more chilling was Herring's claim that Carl had once openly discussed Tracey's $50,000 life insurance policy, suggesting they could dispose of her in the river and claim the windfall. Despite these testimonies, the legal standards of 1990 created a massive hurdle for the prosecution. At the time, Alabama's domestic violence laws were reactive rather than proactive. If a victim declined to file a formal report, law enforcement's ability to intervene or use that history as a primary basis for a murder charge was severely hampered. The investigation hit a fever pitch when it was discovered that at the time of Tracey's death, Carl was involved with a 17-year-old girl. Witnesses alleged that Carl had expressed a desire to marry the teenager but complained that he was tethered to Tracey by the burden of future child support. Reports surfaced that Carl had even told the girl Tracey wouldn't be home if she wanted to visit, a statement made prior to the disappearance. While Carl dismissed these comments as misunderstandings, to the detectives in Dale County, the motive was becoming multifaceted. A combination of financial gain, the desire for a new life with a younger woman, and a documented history of strangulation. Yet, without a smoking gun or a confession, the case began to stall, drifting into the cold files of the Ozark Police Department, while a young Carolyn was left to grow up in the shadow of an unsolved tragedy. The legal paralysis that gripped the investigation in the early 1990s forced a cruel displacement upon the youngest victim of the tragedy. Shortly after Tracey's funeral, 4-year-old Carolyn was removed from Carl's custody and taken in by her maternal grandmother. Seeking to outrun the pervasive whispers of Ozark and the weight of an unsolved homicide, the two moved to Texas, severing all ties with the man the community had already labeled a murderer. In this new environment, Carolyn was raised in a home defined by affection, yet the vacuum left by her mother's absence remained a constant presence. As a child, Carolyn would often dissolve into tears during moments of discipline, calling out for a mother she could only remember through the static of early childhood memory. By the time she reached adulthood, the narrative of her life had been firmly established by the stories of those around her. Her father was a man of violence, and he was the reason her mother was gone. While Carolyn grew up in Texas, Carl Harris sought to reconstruct his own life, far from the prying eyes of Dale County. Moving to South Carolina, he leaned into his physical stature, finding work as a bouncer before transitioning into the construction industry. He started a new family and fathered another daughter, seemingly burying the rumors of 1990 beneath the mundane routines of his new existence. To Carl, the Ozark investigation was a closed chapter of a previous life. To the Ozark Police Department, however, it was a lingering stain on their professional record. The catalyst for change arrived in 2015, following the death of Carolyn's grandmother. Returning to Ozark to bury the woman who had raised her next to Tracey, Carolyn found herself haunted by the proximity of the crime scene. Her return coincided with a significant institutional shift within the Ozark Police Department. Law enforcement in the region was under a renewed spotlight, driven in part by a wider societal push to utilize modern cold case units to resolve long-standing injustices. There was an unspoken but palpable pressure to clear the books, a drive heavily influenced by the 1999 J.B. Beasley and Tracy Hallett case. This unrelated but famous cold case, involving the murder of 2 teenage girls in Ozark, had left the community and its police department under immense national scrutiny for 2 decades. As the department faced a massive push in the mid-2000s to restore public trust and resolve its backlog of failures, the Tracey Harris file was reopened. The cold case unit's review of the 1990 file revealed a narrative that remained stubbornly consistent. When investigators tracked down the original witnesses 25 years later, the accounts of Carl's abuse had not faded with time. The stories of the dinner table strangulation and the threats of murder were recounted with the same chilling clarity as they had been decades prior. One friend recalled Carl's post-murder arrogance, alleging he had once bragged that the police were too unintelligent to catch him. Tracey's aunt echoed this, describing an individual who seemed to believe his own intellect far outstripped that of the local authorities. This renewed focus culminated in 2016. 2 decades of suspicion were distilled into an arrest warrant. Ozark detectives flew to South Carolina, apprehended Carl Harris, and brought him back to Alabama to face a charge of murder. On March 14, 2018, exactly 28 years to the day after Tracey's body was pulled from the Choctawhatchee River, Carl was formally indicted. The prosecution's case, led by District Attorney Kirk Adams and Assistant D.A. Jordan Davis, was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence and a reconstructed timeline of the night of the murder. Their theory was surgically precise. They alleged that on March 7, 1990, Carl had left his job at the supermarket at 9 p.m., returned home, and strangled Tracey in a fit of rage. They believed he then transported her unconscious or dead body 7 miles to the river, disposed of her, and returned to pick up his friend, Bobby Herring, by 9:30 p.m. to establish an alibi. This 30-minute window became the central battlefield for the defense. Carl's attorney, David Harrison, attacked the theory as a logistical impossibility, a fabricated narrative born of political desperation. Harrison pointed out that the proposed route covered 20 miles of driving, a journey that would require at least 20 minutes of pure transit time at high speeds, leaving a mere 10 minutes for the act of murder, the loading of a body, and the disposal at the river. The defense argued that the state was attempting to bend the laws of physics to fit a preconceived notion of Carl's guilt. Harrison also attempted to redirect the investigative gaze toward Bobby Herring, the very man Carl had used as an alibi. Herring possessed a violent criminal history, including a conviction for rape in a neighboring county. However, the prosecution remained unmoved. Herring possessed an airtight alibi for the specific time frame of the murder, and the sheer volume of testimony regarding Carl's history of domestic violence acted as a gravitational pull that kept the investigation centered entirely on the ex-husband. As the trial date of January 13, 2020, approached, the state felt confident. They had 18 witnesses ready to testify to Carl's character and his crimes, believing that the weight of his past would finally secure a conviction for Tracey's future. They were prepared for a trial that would validate 30 years of public opinion, unaware that the most critical witness in the case was about to dismantle their entire reality. The countdown to the January 2020 trial was not merely a legal formality. It was the culmination of 3 decades of collective community trauma. The prosecution's strategy was almost entirely dependent on the oral history of Ozark, a tapestry woven from the memories of 18 witnesses who had watched the slow-motion erosion of Tracey's safety. Among these voices, none were more critical than that of Dawn Beasley. In 1990, as Dawn Halbert, she had been a primary observer of the Harris' domestic life. She was the witness who could testify to the strangulation at the dinner table and the atmosphere of terror Carl had cultivated. To the district attorney's office, she was the star witness, the person whose words would finally bridge the gap between circumstantial suspicion and a guilty verdict. However, as the trial date loomed, a friction began to develop within the prosecution's carefully constructed machine. When investigators reached out to Dawn to prepare her for her testimony, the cooperation they had seen years prior had evaporated. She cited the stresses of her professional life, claiming she was too overwhelmed to testify. This resistance was met with confusion and then frustration by the legal team. From their perspective, a friend of the victim should have been eager to see justice served. The refusal felt like an abandonment of Tracey's memory. Using the power of the state, they issued a subpoena, a move that triggered a visceral, almost histrionic reaction from Dawn. She accused the prosecutors of ruining her life, a statement that seemed wildly disproportionate to the simple act of testifying to the truth. On Friday, January 10, 2020, just 72 hours before the jury was to be seated, the entire foundation of the case against Carl Harris collapsed. In a meeting that was intended to finalize her testimony, Dawn Beasley dropped a revelation that paralyzed the room. She informed Kirk Adams and Jordan Davis that Carl Harris was innocent. She knew this, she claimed, because the man who had actually murdered Tracey Harris was her own ex-husband, Jeff Beasley. The shock of this confession was compounded by the fact that Jeff Beasley's name did not appear anywhere in the massive case files. Despite having lived in the same home as the victim and the primary suspect for a month leading up to the disappearance, Jeff had never been interviewed. He had never been treated as a witness, let alone a person of interest. As the prosecutors re-examined the original investigative materials with this new name in mind, they were confronted with a chilling oversight. During their visits to the crime scene at the Choctawhatchee River, they had seen the name Beasley spray-painted in large white letters on the underside of the bridge, the very site where Tracey's life had ended. At the time, they had dismissed it as random graffiti, unaware that the killer had effectively signed his name at the scene of the crime. The reason for this investigative blind spot was a combination of logistical timing and the psychological trap of tunnel vision. In 1990, Dawn's surname had been Halbert. She and Jeff had not married until shortly after her initial interviews. Because the police were so focused on the documented abuse perpetrated by Carl Harris, they failed to perform the most basic due diligence on the other male occupant of the household. Jeff Beasley was a man with a burgeoning criminal profile. He had recently completed a 5-year prison sentence for burglary. Yet, because no witness had pointed a finger at him, he remained a ghost in the machine of the justice system. Dawn's explanation for her 30-year silence offered a haunting glimpse into the moral compromises of domestic survival. She recounted how, on the night of March 7, 1990, Jeff had woken her in a state of agitation, confessing that he had accidentally hurt Tracey and that she was dead. He claimed he had transported the body to the river specifically to ensure Carl would not find it in the house. At the time, Dawn was pregnant and on the verge of starting a new life. She told prosecutors that she was faced with an impossible choice: deliver justice for a friend and destroy her own family, or remain silent and preserve her child's future. She chose the latter. For 13 years of marriage, through Jeff's subsequent 5-year imprisonment for another burglary and their eventually abusive divorce, the secret remained buried. Dawn admitted that while she felt a distant pity for Tracey's daughter, Carolyn, her primary concern had been the preservation of her own stability. She had watched for decades as the town of Ozark blamed Carl Harris. She had even given statements to police that technically contained the truth about Carl's abuse, but she had carefully navigated those interviews to avoid the one question she dreaded: who killed Tracey? By her own admission, she felt a sense of relief each time she walked out of a police station without having had to tell a direct lie. It was only when the state's subpoena forced her into a corner where silence was no longer an option that she finally chose to exhume the truth, regardless of the lives it would upend. The revelation of a new suspect, hidden in plain sight for 3 decades, forced the district attorney's office into a frantic, high-stakes pivot. With the trial of Carl Harris scheduled to begin in 72 hours, investigators moved to locate Jeff Beasley, who was still living in Ozark and working as a truck driver. The man who had managed to evade even a cursory interview in 1990 was suddenly sitting in an interrogation room, facing the ghosts of a crime he believed he had outrun. Initially, Beasley maintained a posture of total denial. He went so far as to agree to a polygraph examination, a psychological gambit often employed by suspects who believe their own narrative is impenetrable. Though he failed the examination, the results were legally inadmissible, a reminder of the forensic complexities that often plague cold case investigations. Polygraphs, notoriously unreliable and susceptible to the physiological effects of stress, are frequently viewed by the legal community not as a search for truth, but as a tactical tool to apply pressure. That pressure eventually reached its breaking point. After 4 hours of intensive questioning, the 30-year wall of silence finally collapsed. Jeff Beasley confessed to the murder of Tracey Harris. However, the narrative Beasley provided introduced a new set of contradictions that seemed to clash with the established facts of Tracey's life. He claimed that he and Tracey had been engaged in a clandestine affair, a secret relationship that flourished while he and Dawn lived in the Harris household. According to Beasley, they had met under the bridge at the Choctawhatchee River on the night of March 7, 1990, to discuss their future. He alleged that Tracey had demanded he leave Dawn so they could be together, and when he refused, a violent argument ensued. Beasley's description of the actual act of killing was both vague and haunting. He claimed they were waiting in the river when Tracey went down and didn't come back up. When confronted with the medical examiner's findings of manual strangulation, his response was a chilling deflection. "I didn't strangle her. I remember taking her, pushing her underwater. I mean, if the autopsy says it, though, I guess." This admission exposed the fundamental cruelty of the act. Tracey, a woman whose profound fear of water was documented by everyone who knew her, had spent her final moments struggling against both a predator and her deepest phobia. Beasley's claim that they were wading in the river voluntarily was viewed by many as a final, posthumous insult to the victim, a narrative designed to mitigate his own guilt by suggesting Tracey had willingly entered the environment that terrified her. The affair narrative was also met with deep skepticism by the community and the prosecution. No friend or family member had ever seen a shred of evidence to suggest Tracey was unfaithful, and Dawn herself dismissed the idea as highly unlikely. In many homicide investigations, the claim of a crime of passion, or a dispute during an affair, is a common strategy used by perpetrators to humanize their motives or shift a degree of blame onto the victim. Whether the affair was a reality or a fabrication designed to explain his presence at the river, the result was the same: a confession that finally aligned with the physical evidence of the 1990 autopsy. The timing of this legal resolution carried a heavy, almost cinematic irony. On January 13, 2020, the very day the trial against Carl Harris was set to begin, and remarkably the day of his 55th birthday, the state moved to dismiss all charges against him. The man who had been the town's villain for 30 years, who had been arrested and indicted based on the weight of his own bad reputation, was suddenly a free man. The dismissal was a profound embarrassment for the investigative process, but a triumph for the defense. David Harrison, Carl's attorney, was quick to highlight the systemic failures that had led to this moment. He argued that if the police had performed a basic canvass of the household occupants in 1990, the tragedy of a 30-year cold case and the near wrongful conviction of his client could have been avoided. While the prosecution defended their actions by pointing to the overwhelming testimony regarding Carl's domestic abuse, the legal reality remained. They had nearly sent a man to prison for a murder he did not commit because they had prioritized character over evidence. For Jeff Beasley, the legal reckoning was swift. In July 2020, he pleaded guilty to the murder of Tracey Harris. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a term that mirrored the exact amount of time he had spent as a free man while Tracey's family suffered in the dark. The sentencing provided a definitive end to the mystery of who had killed Tracey Harris, but it did little to resolve the complex web of trauma that the case had left in its wake. The focus of the community now shifted from the who to the what now, as the survivors of the tragedy were forced to reconcile with a truth that was far more complicated than the one they had believed for 3 decades. The dismissal of the murder charges provided Carl Harris with physical liberty, but it failed to grant him the communal absolution he sought. In the wake of his release, Carl attempted to pivot from the accused to the accuser. In 2021, he filed a high-profile lawsuit against the city of Ozark, demanding $6 million in damages. His legal complaint was a litany of grievances: false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. In a formal affidavit, Carl claimed that the Ozark Police Department had not only been negligent, but had actively fabricated information to secure his arrest in 2016. He maintained that his reputation had been systematically dismantled by an incompetent investigation that ignored the true killer in favor of a convenient scapegoat. However, the legal system proved to be as resistant to Carl's demands as it had been to his initial arrest. The lawsuit was dismissed by a judge in 2020, and a subsequent amended complaint met the same fate. The court's refusal to grant Carl financial retribution highlighted a lingering tension in the case. While he was legally innocent of Tracey's murder, the shadow of his documented history with the victim remained. District Attorney Kirk Adams, while expressing formal sympathy for the years Carl spent under a cloud of suspicion, remained steadfast in his defense of the original arrest. From the perspective of the state, the evidence of Carl's domestic violence was not a fabrication. It was a recorded reality supported by over 15 witnesses. In the eyes of the law, the tunnel vision that led to Carl's arrest was a result of his own past actions, creating a narrative so compelling that it had blinded an entire department to other possibilities. This stalemate between character and crime was most painfully felt in the relationship between Carl and his daughter. Following the dismissal of the charges, Carl held a press conference, making a public plea for Carolyn to reach out to him and build the relationship they had lost 30 years prior. But for Carolyn, the truth was a double-edged sword. While she expressed a profound sense of relief that her father was not a murderer, acknowledging that a weight had been lifted from her life, the exoneration did not erase the stories of abuse she had lived with since childhood. The fracture in their relationship was laid bare on a national stage during appearances on the Dr. Phil television program. During these segments, the complex layers of the case were dissected further. Carl continued to vehemently deny that he had ever laid a hand on Tracey, admitting only to occasional arguments. This denial became the ultimate barrier to reconciliation. Carolyn remained firm in her position. She could not offer forgiveness to a man who refused to acknowledge the pain he had inflicted on her mother. To Carolyn, the witnesses were not lying, and the 15 separate accounts of violence were too consistent to be ignored. Until Carl was man enough to look her in the eye and apologize for the abuse, the door to a relationship remained firmly shut. The Dr. Phil appearances also introduced new, unsubstantiated claims from Carl's defense attorney, David Harrison. Harrison attempted to further distance his client from the crime by alleging that Tracey had been involved with 2 other men besides Carl and Jeff Beasley. He also revealed a previously unknown detail from the investigation, that Carl's friend, Bobby Herring, had been convinced by authorities to wear a wire in an attempt to catch Carl in a confession. The fact that the wire recorded nothing incriminating was used by the defense as proof of Carl's innocence, yet it also served as a reminder of how desperately the state had tried to fit Carl into the role of the killer. As the legal and personal battles reached a weary conclusion, the figures who had remained silent for 30 years were forced to reckon with their legacies. Dawn Beasley eventually offered a public apology to Carolyn for her part in the 3-decade-long deception. However, in a case defined by such extreme durations of silence, words of regret often felt inadequate. Dawn's admission that she felt more sorry for herself than for Carolyn during those 30 years served as a final, stark commentary on the human capacity for self-preservation at the expense of justice. The story of Tracey Harris remains a landmark case study in the dangers of investigative tunnel vision and the shifting landscape of domestic violence laws. It is a narrative where justice was eventually served, but only through a series of near-catastrophic legal errors and a sudden, reluctant confession. The Choctawhatchee River, once a place of childhood fear and adult tragedy, eventually surrendered its secrets, but not before the lives of everyone involved were irrevocably altered. In the end, the closure achieved was bittersweet. A killer was finally behind bars, but the 30 years of communal suspicion, parental absence, and institutional failure had left scars that no courtroom verdict could fully heal. Tracey Harris finally has justice, but the 30-year delay remains a bitter pill to swallow. Dawn Beasley prioritized her own family's stability over the life of a friend and the freedom of an innocent man. It raises a chilling moral dilemma. Where do we draw the line between self-preservation and common decency? Was Dawn a protective mother or a silent accomplice to a tragedy? If you held a secret that could destroy your family but set a man free, what would you do? Write your answer in the comments.